I had a very difficult session this afternoon with the commanders of the various services as we attempt to explain this to our people. Our people see the degrading, declining security situation around the world, and so trying to explain this to them is very difficult.
That's the House Committee on National Defence hearing from the Chief of the Defence Staff about potential cuts of $1 billion to the military's overall budget. It comes, of course, just weeks after Canada assured its NATO allies that it was committed to reaching the alliance spending target of 2% of GDP. Tom Lawson is a retired general and a former Chief of the Defence Staff. I spoke with him just this morning about all this. General Tom Lawson, thank you for being here. Appreciate it, sir.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So the current Chief of the Defence Staff, Wayne Eyre, says there's no way to take $1 billion out of the defence budget and not have an impact. I would imagine that to be true, but what are your concerns when you hear that big a potential number?
Well, a couple of concerns, really. Nationally, we should listen very carefully to what General Eyre is saying. He's already across the regular forces and reserves short by 15,000 people. This isn't going to help. It's not going to help with his recruiting efforts. And Canadians here across the country have been relying on his help in emergencies, fire, floods, and hurricanes more and more in comparison to when I was Chief of Defence a while ago. Internationally, it really does damage our reputation in our key alliances. When just recently the indication was we were going the other direction and large amounts of money were going to be added to the defense budget.
Well, and I want to get into that a little bit more, but first let me put to you what the Defence Minister, Will Blair, says. He says that Canada is not cutting defence spending because overall defence spending has increased and will continue to increase in part because of some of these big purchases Canada's making, right? The F-35s, the new warships. I don't know how you square those statements then, that the budget continues to go up, but that cuts also need to be made.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors going on there. What the minister, I think, is referring to is the fact that in coming years, a lot of these fleets that are starting to rust out, vehicles, aircraft, ships, need replacement. And happily, the fighters are coming in coming years, and the ships are underway. Various Army vehicles will be replaced. So there are significant amounts of money that are going to go into procurement. Unfortunately, this $900 million is largely going to come out of an operational and training budget, which provides the Canadian Forces with everything they need to train and be ready to support Canadians and to be ready to deploy for really important missions like the one that Canada is leading in Latvia right now. So kind of two different things. The minister's right that significant amounts are going to be spent in coming years, but this is really tough for the Chief of Defence regarding training next year.
Okay, so it's sort of where the money goes. When you were CDS in 2014, you were faced with some pretty big asks as well in terms of budget reductions. At the time, you said that it would have a major impact on the country's readiness, and you also warned that it would have long-term implications. Tell me about what that was like to try and juggle what I think is the primary role of the CDS, which is to keep the forces and the military ready, and have these budgetary pressures.
Right. So it's a similar message, isn't it? I was saying the same thing when we were trying to cut $2 billion back then, as the Chief of Defence is saying now. And I think this goes to the bigger point, and that is that in Canada, successive governments have taken a deep discount on defence. 10 years ago, with Afghanistan or Canada's participation in Afghanistan coming to an end, it looked like a fairly safe bet. But 10 years later, with security issues around the world really kind of peaking, China becoming far more aggressive, Russia in Ukraine, various things happening around the world that require Canadian involvement, it becomes a far more difficult thing, especially considering that deep discounts have been taken not only when I was Chief of Defence, but previous to my time as Chief of Defence too. This is a common theme that Canadian governments take deep discount on defence. It's a really tough thing to do now.
What about internationally? You alluded to it and how this might impact our reputation. Obviously, the government has said it plans to meet the NATO target. It's been much criticized for not reaching that 2% of GDP. Is there a way to do that while still making cuts to operations and training, to your point?
No, there isn't. There's a pretty good article in The Economist this morning indicating that it has been recognized internationally that Canada is going back on the words that were, that the commitment that was provided at Vilnius at the NATO summit just a short period ago. The downside here is that Canada doesn't look serious when it comes to defense commitments, and therefore the reliability of our nation is in question amongst our alliance. There is a positive message here that Canadians should take away, not from the proposed budget cuts, but from the international response. And that is that even though Canada is, no more of a laggard than, say, Belgium or Spain or Turkey in terms of spending, there's far more concern about Canada because Canada has typically been one of the key leaders for important NATO activities, like is happening on the eastern side of NATO right now in Latvia. Canada is seen as a leader. The commitment that they've had to defense has been very, very important. Everyone in NATO knows that the Canadian capabilities are very small in number, but very high in quality. And so to see Canada backing off is of great concern to our alliance members.
Yeah, I was going to say, I even hear it, and I'm not tapped into the defense world, but I do hear from, let's call them allies, about concerns about where Canada is in defense spending. And I wonder if at some point that frustration will be made public, or if there is pressure being put on Canada quietly, especially when, for instance, they see these headlines.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is constant pressure coming from the Secretary General of NATO, but low-level pressure, because Canada is one of the countries he relies on for leadership, and he's also got to put pressure on a lot of several other countries within NATO to up their game. I think more importantly, the disappointment for anyone interested in defense in Canada is that President Biden really let Canada off the hook, let this government off the hook when he came up. I think there was an expectation broadly across the country that he was going to press hard for Canadians to up their game in defense. When he didn't do that, I think it gave the current government some breathing room, and I think they're using that now to decrease their commitments to defense. So, I think we're seeing that pressure is very important internationally. More to the point, I think the concern is that if we're not seen as really good alliance partners and really serious about defense and security, when we need alliance partners, for instance, to counter threats up in the Arctic region, where Canada's claims may not be fully accepted worldwide, our friends may not be there to help us, just like we may not be there to help them as much as a result of these defense cuts.